Chapter 21 Countess Rosalia reluctantly left Jeanette behind at the Sapphire Palace as she returned to her own territory for the summer holidays. The tension between the two was palpable. Jeanette, still confined to her room, could do nothing but stare out the window, waiting for any sign of change. It had been weeks since her punishment began, and still, there was no sign that the Emperor would lift her probation or allow her to leave the palace. Rosalia's departure felt like abandonment to Jeanette, though the Countess had no choice. The Emperor had made it clear that Jeanette was being punished for Rosalia's crimes, the false accusations that had been made against Princess Athanasia. The young girl had never been involved in the slanderous rumors, yet she had become the target of the Emperor's wrath. For now, her only crime was her blood relation to someone who had dared to insult the princess. Rosalia, although concerned for Jeanette, knew there was little she could do at the moment. Her own position was precarious. She was walking on a thin line, unable to speak out or intervene without risking her own life. The thought of facing the Emperor's wrath was enough to keep her silent, her heart heavy with guilt. She didn't want to leave Jeanette in such a dire situation, but she had no other choice. Before Rosalia left, she visited Jeanette one last time in her room. The girl sat quietly by the window, her face distant as she gazed at the palace grounds. Rosalia's heart broke as she looked at her niece, so young and innocent, yet caught in a web of politics and mistakes not her own. "I'll be back soon," Rosalia said softly, trying to offer some comfort, though she knew the words were empty. Jeanette didn't respond, but her eyes shifted towards Rosalia, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. She had been locked away for far too long, her only company the servants who brought her food and the occasional visit from the royal physician. She longed for the freedom she once had, but with no clear end to her confinement, hope was becoming increasingly difficult to hold on to. Rosalia left the Sapphire Palace with a heavy heart, her departure leaving Jeanette behind in her solitary punishment. As Rosalia traveled back to her estate, she couldn't shake the guilt that weighed on her. She knew that her silence had condemned her niece to this fate, but at the moment, she felt powerless to change anything. Jeanette's probation remained in effect, and the princess's fate was still tied to the decisions of those who held power over her. Would she remain in this prison until the Emperor's anger cooled, or would someone find a way to intercede on her behalf? For now, all Rosalia could do was pray for Jeanette's strength as she continued her life under the watchful eyes of the Sapphire Palace. Jeanette's perspective. I sat in my room in the Sapphire Palace, confined within these walls, and my thoughts were racing. What was supposed to be Lucas's trial for the destruction of the Sapphire Palace had turned into my wrongful conviction. And yet, somehow, there was a part of me that knew there was some truth to the rumor. I didn't want to admit it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. That day, everything had spiraled out of control. I wasn't even involved in any of it. I didn't start the rumors, didn't slander my sister, Athanasia, but somehow, here I was, caught in the chaos. Aunt Rosalia was the one who spread the lies about my sister, but no one seemed to care about that. They just blamed me. I tried to ignore the whispers in my mind, the ones telling me that maybe part of the rumor had some truth. I had seen the way Athanasia, my sister, had stood there, silent, while Lucas had taunted me. Why didn't she stop him? Why didn't she say anything to defend me? I had been left there, defenseless, with no one to help me. The grand hall of the imperial court had been tense that day, as nobles gathered around Lucas, all eyes on him. He wasn't worried at all. He just sat back, acting like none of this mattered. Like he didn't care about anything, least of all the destruction he had caused. Then, Athanasia, my sister, stood up and asked him why he was angry. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the frustration beneath it. And then Lucas just casually mentioned a rumor, the one that had been circulating about her. The rumor that she had stood by and watched as I was bullied, not lifting a finger to stop it. Part of me knew that there was truth in that. I had seen it too. Athanasia hadn't helped me. She hadn't said anything, hadn't moved to stop Lucas. She had just watched. Maybe she didn't think it was her place, or maybe she was too afraid. But the pain I felt in that moment was real. Why had she just stood there? My father, the emperor, looked at me with a gaze so cold it made my blood run cold too. Come here, he commanded. I didn't know what to do. I was so terrified, but I had no choice but to obey. I stepped forward, trembling. Before I could say anything, my father slapped me. The force of it knocked me to the floor, and everything went silent. I couldn't even react. My cheek stung where his hand had struck me. It felt as though the whole world was watching, but I didn't matter to anyone. I wanted to defend myself, to scream that I hadn't done anything wrong, but nothing came out. My body shook with fear, and all I could do was clutch my cheek, staring up at my father through blurred vision. Why did you have to drag my daughter down with you? His voice was as cold as ice, each word cutting deeper than the last. But I hadn't dragged anyone down. It wasn't my fault. It wasn't. I saw Athanasia try to intervene, rushing forward and grabbing his arm, but it was too late. She couldn't change anything now. And then Lucas, that smug, insufferable man, had to make it worse. He started going on about how everyone had been too afraid to stop him. How all the adults, servants, Felix, even Lillian, had just stood by and done nothing. But he singled me out. Me, the one who hadn't done anything, and yet was the one paying for it all. His words were like daggers. Why was all the blame placed on the princess, he said, his eyes flashing with something like amusement. But it wasn't amusement for me. It was pain. It was confusion. How could everyone just stand there and watch? Why was I the one being punished? The emperor, my father, wasn't done. He grabbed me by the neck and lifted me off the ground, his grip tight enough that I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even scream. All I could do was gasp for air and claw weakly at his hand, my legs kicking desperately. Stop. I wanted to scream, but no sound left my throat. Why was he doing this to me? Why wasn't anyone helping? Athanasia kept pleading with him, trying to make him see reason, but her voice couldn't reach him. He was too angry, and I was too afraid. Lucas, as always, just stood there, watching it all unfold. He mocked everyone, taunting the nobles who were too frightened to act, calling them hypocrites. But he wasn't wrong. They were all too afraid to stop the emperor, to stop him. And then, in one swift motion, my father, Claude, dropped me to the floor. My body hit the ground hard, and I gasped for air, trembling as I struggled to regain my breath. His words rang in my ears. Put this thing on probation. Lock it under house arrest in the Sapphire Palace. I couldn't even look up as the guards moved to drag me away. I was numb, frozen in place, my mind screaming that this wasn't fair. But it didn't matter. I had no voice here. No one was listening to me. Why had I been punished? Was it my fault? Or had I been punished because of Athanasia's silence? Because of Aunt Rosalia's lies? I wanted to fight back. I wanted to scream, to tell everyone the truth, but I was trapped in this nightmare. As Jeanette sat alone in her room, the weight of her confinement pressed heavily upon her. Her thoughts kept returning to that day, the trial, the accusation, the emperor's fury. It was all so unfair. She wanted to run to her father, to explain that it wasn't her who had slandered Princess Athanasia, but her Aunt Rosalia. But that night, after Jeanette had been locked in her room, it was Rosalia who came to her. The woman's face was a mask of urgency and fear, and her voice was laced with both desperation and cunning. Jeanette, you mustn't tell the truth, her aunt had said, lowering her voice to a near whisper. Do you truly believe the princess will vouch for me if she finds out the truth? Jeanette froze at the question. She had thought of the princess as her sister, someone who would stand by her. How could anyone doubt that? But Rosalia's face twisted, revealing her fear. You saw how the emperor reacted, didn't you? She continued, pacing the room, her eyes darting toward the door as though expecting someone to burst in at any moment. If the truth comes out, the princess won't protect me. Do you think she'll risk her position for mine? I'm already in enough trouble with the emperor. If I'm implicated in this, it's over. Do you think she'll vouch for me? She won't, Jeanette. She'll stand by her father. The words stung more than Jeanette expected. Could her aunt really be so sure of the princess's betrayal? Athanasia didn't know Jeanette, but she thought she would do what was right. Would she really let her aunt suffer the consequences? I don't know, Jeanette whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Rosalia's tone softened, but it was full of manipulation. Please, Jeanette, you have to trust me. If you tell the truth now, you'll only make things worse. You'll drag us both down. You don't want that, do you? Jeanette hesitated, the weight of the decision sinking in. But Aunt Rosalia, the princess, she has to know the truth. Rosalia smiled then, though it wasn't a comforting smile, it was cold, calculated. If the truth comes out, do you really think Athanasia will risk everything to save me? She won't. She's the emperor's daughter, after all. She'll choose him over me any day. Jeanette was silent, the words rattling in her mind. What if Rosalia was right? What if Athanasia didn't care enough about her to vouch for her aunt, to speak out for the truth? I don't want to die, Jeanette, Rosalia said softly, her voice almost pleading now. You have to stay silent. Don't tell anyone what really happened. Do it for both of us. Promise me. With a heavy heart, Jeanette had agreed. She could barely bring herself to voice the promise, but the fear in her aunt's eyes was too overwhelming. She couldn't bring herself to turn her away. And so, Jeanette kept silent. Unbeknownst to her, as she agreed to hold her tongue, her Aunt Rosalia smiled with quiet satisfaction. She had won, for now. But what Jeanette didn't know, what her aunt didn't know, was how much this silence would cost them both in the end. Countess Rosalia entered her estate with a heavy heart, her footsteps echoing through the grand foyer. Her eyes narrowed with frustration as she was greeted not by her husband, but by his mistress, Lady Seraphine, and the two children they shared together. The sight of them, especially Seraphine's smug expression, filled Rosalia with resentment. House Bencroft had become nothing more than a hollow name. Her husband, Aemon, had long since lost all affection for her, and if not for her son, Lucian, she would have been cast aside long ago. Their marriage, once a partnership of power and influence, was now a mere formality, an arrangement held together only by the presence of Lucian, who still bore her name. As she stepped inside, Rosalia's gaze swept across the foyer, settling on the figures before her. Ah, back at last, Lady Seraphine said, her voice laced with feigned sweetness. She stood near the staircase, one hand resting casually on the railing. Her eyes glinted with a subtle challenge, as if daring Rosalia to say something. Where is Aemon? Rosalia asked, her tone sharp, betraying her irritation. Seraphine's smile deepened, but it lacked warmth. Your husband is in his study. He's busy, she said, her words carrying a hint of mockery. Rosalia clenched her jaw, the contempt in her chest rising. She refused to show any weakness before this woman. Her attention shifted to the two children now standing at Seraphine's side, Lucian's half-siblings, the children of Aemon and Seraphine. Cedric, a quiet boy of about 8, stood beside Seraphine with his head down, his dark hair falling over his eyes. He was the quiet type, and though still young, he had inherited his mother's cold, calculating nature. Annalise, a girl of 12, was a sharp contrast. Tall for her age, with pale skin and dark eyes, she held herself with a certain grace, but Rosalia could see the arrogance that was starting to grow in her, the same arrogance Seraphine had. Mother, Lucian's voice interrupted her thoughts. Rosalia turned to find him at the top of the staircase, leaning against the banister. At 17, Lucian had become the spitting image of his father, cold and detached. His hair was a shade darker than Aemon's, but his piercing gaze and sharp features were undeniably Aemon's. Rosalia forced a smile. Lucian, how have you been? He gave her a brief glance before descending the stairs, his expression unreadable. I've been fine, Mother, he replied in a flat tone. But I'm sure you already knew that. Rosalia's heart sank at his indifference. It was clear to her now, her son was drifting away, no longer the child who sought her approval. He had aligned himself with Seraphine and her children, and no amount of effort on her part could bring him back. "I'm home," Rosalia said, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. "Where's your father?" Lucien shrugged as he walked past her, his gaze flickering towards Cedric and Annalise. "He's in his study, as usual," he said dismissively. Lady Seraphine watched the exchange with a faint smile, her eyes glimmering with satisfaction. "Your husband's focus is no longer on you, Rosalia. He's too occupied with other matters. You know, perhaps you should reconsider how much longer you wish to remain here." Her words, though polite, carried an edge of threat. Rosalia narrowed her eyes, but said nothing. Seraphine's smugness was infuriating, but there was nothing she could do now. She had been discarded from her husband's affections long ago, and Seraphine's presence was a constant reminder of that fact. The sound of footsteps interrupted the tense silence as Eamon appeared at the door to his study, his expression as indifferent as ever. His cold blue eyes flickered over Rosalia before resting on Lucien. "Ah, Rosalia. You're back," he said with little emotion in his voice. "I trust everything went as planned?" Rosalia's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She could see the shift in his gaze, the distance that had only grown between them. "Everything is fine, Eamon," she replied through gritted teeth. His gaze flickered briefly to Seraphine, then back to Rosalia. "Good," he said. "We'll discuss matters later. For now, I need some peace." Lucien shot Rosalia one final, indifferent glance before turning to join Seraphine and her children. As Rosalia watched her son, her heart heavy with the weight of lost love, she realized with painful clarity that the house she had once ruled was no longer hers to command. Seraphine had usurped her position, and Lucien had chosen his loyalty. The door closed behind them with a finality that echoed through the halls. Rosalia stood by the tall arched window of her chamber, fingers clutching the velvet drapes as she gazed over the sun-drenched estate. The summer air was thick with the scent of blooming roses and freshly cut grass, but she barely noticed. The golden light streaming through the windows did little to warm the cold bitterness that had long settled in her heart. When had everything gone to hell? There was a time when House Judith had been among the most prestigious in the empire, a family of great influence and wealth. Their future had seemed secure when they arranged for their youngest daughter, Penelope, to be engaged to the second prince, Claude de Alger-Obelia. It had been a match of ambition, ensuring that the Judith name would stand alongside the imperial family itself. And then, fate had handed them an even greater triumph. The second prince had taken the throne, not by inheritance, but by force. With Claude crowned as the new emperor, House Judith had risen to the height of power. Penelope, once a mere noble's daughter, was to be the future empress. But then, the unthinkable happened. Penelope had disappeared. One moment she was the emperor's fiancée, the next, she was gone. Rumors swirled, had she offended him? Had she fled? Or had she simply been discarded like trash? The reason didn't matter. What mattered was the shame that followed. House Judith, which had once stood at the pinnacle of society, became a name spoken with ridicule. The family's influence crumbled, its daughters branded as unwanted and disgraced. And Rosalia had suffered for it. Once, she had been engaged to a duke. She had been raised to be a duchess, groomed to stand among the highest noblewomen. But her sister's failure had ruined everything. The engagement was called off, and no respectable nobleman would have her. Desperate to salvage what they could, her family had brokered a lesser match, Count Eamon Vencroft. His influence was minor, his status far beneath what she had once been promised, but the Judiths had no choice. In exchange for a generous dowry, Rosalia had been married off to secure a mere count's title. It had been a marriage of convenience, nothing more. Eamon never pretended to love her. He had needed money, and she had needed a husband. That was their unspoken understanding. But even that dignity had been taken from her when, barely a year after she bore him a son, Eamon had openly brought his mistress into their home. Seraphine. A woman of the landed gentry, beautiful, but beneath her in every way. Rosalia had swallowed her pride, agreeing to tolerate the woman's presence under one condition, that his indiscretions remain discreet. That no one in the capital should ever know. But Aemon had never cared for her demands. Not only had he kept his mistress in their home, but he had also fathered 2 children with her, Annalise and Cedric. His bastards were now raised in her household, growing up alongside her son, Lucian, as if they had the same right to the Vencroft name. Worse still, Seraphine had not remained a quiet mistress. She had become the true lady of the house, the one whom Aemon favored, the one whom the servants obeyed without question. Rosalia had been reduced to nothing more than a figurehead. A countess in name only. If not for Lucian, she would have been cast out entirely. She had endured every humiliation, every slight. And for what? Because of her sister's failure. Penelope had destroyed their family's future. And now, another Judith girl, Jeanette, was about to lose everything too. Rosalia's lips pressed into a thin line. Jeanette was foolish, naive, desperate for love. But that also made her useful. If Rosalia played her cards right, she could turn the girl into something more than a discarded bastard. She could mold Jeanette into the key to restoring her family's lost glory. Jeanette would be her redemption. And this time, Rosalia would not fail. Like, comment and subscribe to be notified for updates in the series.